Modern day steering wheels may have a little bit of artistic flair and also some functionality with various steering wheel controls, but overall they're not necessarily thought of as pieces of art. However, back in the day, a number of steering wheels that were employed in classic cars had a beautiful artistic flair and overall form about them. In this video, we're going to talk about the top 10 steering wheels in domestic cars. At least this is my opinion, obviously a subjective topic. And if you feel that I miss one or you disagree, drop a comment in the comments section. Now, before we get the list started, I will just say that one of my favorite steering wheels in a non-domestic car would be from the Citroën DS, which is this beautiful single-spoke design that would become a hallmark of Citroën cars. But again, we're going to focus on domestics for this list. So let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have one of the all-time great sports cars, the 1963 Corvette. Now, the exterior of the 1963 Corvette is highly recognized by most anyone who's familiar with cars. And of course, that signature boat tail-like rear end with that split window that existed for just 1 year, 1963, gives the car a flair all of its own. Of course, it's not just that boat tail style rear that's awesome on the 63 Corvette, but also the four fender bumps, kind of a four fender like car, and all of the fake jewelry that adorns the outside, including the fake hood grills as well as the scoops behind the door and behind the front wheels. But as we turn to the interior, we see an interior with the typical Corvette dual cockpit theme that's extremely prominent, as you can see here. A vertical radio and a beautiful, lithe, athletically slim steering wheel with a three-spoke design. There's just something beautiful about this steering wheel that somehow manages to look both slim as well as formidable at the same time. Those three spokes that are hollowed out, and that center section with the dual flag design is another just beautiful piece that complements the overall design of the steering wheel. And while the wheel itself certainly is beautiful, the overall interior of the 63 Corvette is just another piece of artwork that complements the stunningly gorgeous exterior, especially with all of these beautiful round gauges that you can see here in front of the driver, helping him or her understand what's happening under hood and with the car while they're operating it. Let's move on to number 9. At number 9, we have the 1959 Chevrolet. In 1959, General Motors full-sizers were all new, and they had a much more dramatic as well as light feeling to them versus the 1958 models that they replaced. GM designers elected to go in this direction, particularly after seeing the 1957 forward-look Chryslers that had very thin roofs and beautiful fins and overall just excellent design, and felt that they had to modernize their 1959 lineup, and in fact threw out what was the original proposals for the 59 and rushed these designs into production. Now, as I mentioned, Chrysler had introduced a number of, well, let's just say cars that were tail fin happy for 1957. And of course, GM had a number of fins on its cars for 59, most prominently the Cadillac. But Chevrolet went with this alternate style fin, this, I guess you could call it horizontal fin, kind of like an aircraft wing out back. And it was a recognizable design from really anywhere when you saw the car. Now, as we transition to the interior of that beautiful 1959 Chevrolet Impala, take a look here. Now, this is a very rare Impala with a 4-speed manual shifter. And this was paired with, on this particular car, with a 283 cubic inch V8 under hood. But notice the steering wheel in this Impala and how it kind of has this Swiss cheese look to it on the dual spoke wheel. And you have the light little horn ring down there that you can push to beep the horn. The steering wheel was actually inspired by racing-style steering wheels, hence its hollowed-out design. And what it's doing in a 1959 Impala, I don't quite know, but I think it looks great. You also see, similar to the Corvette we just talked about, a bit of the dual cockpit theme here in the 59 Impala. And you have some round gauges as well that were trying to give the interior a bit of a sporting flair. Remember, a lot of cars at this point had horizontal speedometers, and really those round gauges were sometimes reserved for the more sporty vehicles. So you got a round set of gauges and a sporty set of gauges at that, and a sporty wheel to pilot your 59 Impala around. I will say that the seating position in these 1959 GM cars is pretty sporty. It's very low and legs out if you've never sat in one, almost too much so. And when these cars would be redesigned for 1961, the overall seating height was raised, in part because some customers felt it was just too low. But the cars certainly looked cool, and the steering wheel was also a winner. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have the 1958 Lincoln. Now, the Lincolns were all new for 1958 and on a unibody platform built at Wixom. And it's kind of strange to say that these enormous 131-inch wheelbase vehicles were unibody, but they certainly were. And the overall form of the 58 Lincolns is something that, let's just say, is controversial in automotive history. In fact, it was so controversial that the Mark series, the Mark 3, 4, and 5, produced in 1958, 1959, and 1960, were actually effectively forgotten when Lincoln introduced its Mark III yet again in 1969, despite already having introduced a Mark III for 1958. Some people love these 58, 59, and 60 Lincolns, and some people hate them. I personally am a lover, particularly of the 58 that has the most dramatic body-side sculpturing. And it's not only because of the exterior, but also let's take a look at the interior of the 1958 Lincoln, because it has a number of beautiful design elements and high-quality materials. One of my favorite elements of the interior, though, is the instrument panel, which in this 1958 Lincoln was a new style design with this kind of mid-century modern-esque pod form. And in the middle, you have this semicircular speedometer, and to the left of that, a circle that denotes the climate control. This was an interesting climate control setup. It's just one particular, I guess, dial, if you will, that shows you what mode that the heater or air conditioner, this is a non-air conditioning equipped car because the bottom left quadrant of that circle is not populated. But it would tell you if you were on vent or heat or air conditioning and you turned one knob to basically activate all the different settings and pulled it out for the fan speed. Kind of a cool setup. But the wheel in the 1958 Lincoln is also a beautiful element of the design. It almost looks like it's a 3-spoke design, but it's really a 4-spoker. And it was just around in this year in 1958. In 1959, they would change the wheel to something different. But for me, I love the 58's design and this kind of two-tone wheel with the white bottom. And the spokes, the uppermost spokes are just singular. The bottom two are, I just love the way that that comes together into one as it touches the rim. And the horn ring is also good looking. Of course, you have the Continental Star in the middle too that is especially attractive and complements the overall design of the wheel. So the 58 Lincoln for me is one of those that I just love the extreme body side sculpture on the exterior, and I also love the interior, in particular, the steering wheel that was just mentioned. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the 1957 DeSoto. Now, we previously mentioned the forward-look Chryslers that were introduced for 1957, and my personal favorite is the 57 DeSoto. Unfortunately, this would be just a few model years before DeSoto would be phased out after 1961. And it's amazing because I think the 57 DeSoto is one of the best-looking cars, certainly of that model year, and maybe even of the 50s. Has this wonderful styling associated with it. I love the triple tail lamps and that gently rising quarter panel out back, along with the light and thin roof, the thin A-pillars, just an overall beautiful design that really set the industry back on its heels when it was introduced. I also love the two-toning on this particular model, the black with, I guess it's kind of like a coral color, and the black lower is accentuated by the roof, which is also black. And here we have the rear of a DeSoto. This is a Fireflight, the top-of-the-line DeSoto. Again, take a look at those triple tail lamps and the exhaust coming out of the bumper. This thing looks like it was something that the Jetsons would drive around. Just is an absolutely fantastic automobile. But the cool nature of the DeSoto wasn't just on the outside. It was also on the inside, in particular with the steering wheel, because the 57 DeSoto steering wheel featured an optional piece of equipment that I don't really think I've seen before or since on other cars, and that is that the steering wheel could be had with a clock in the middle of it. Take a look here. The steering wheel in this DeSoto Adventurer is, again, something that's just a piece of artwork. I love the fact that it's a two-spoker with this beautiful, actually thick horn ring, which was something that you didn't often see. The horn rings were usually pretty thin, and the wheel has two different size diameters to it. That upper white portion is a smaller diameter than the lower, and of course you have these little grips that are kind of at the 8 o'clock, I guess, if you will, and 4 o'clock position. I don't know who would place their hands there, but, well, those hand grips are there. But take a look at the middle of the steering wheel, and you see a clock in the middle of it. I thought that was a particularly awesome feature of these DeSotos, and something that you really just don't see on other cars. And it gives that interior this look of fine jewelry, as I was talking about with some of the others, that is unparalleled by other cars from 1957. Overall, the 57 DeSoto, again, another car that had this dramatic exterior and also some fine detailing to the interior. Just an awesome ride. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the 1965 Pontiac. Now, the 1965 Pontiacs were some of the most lauded in Pontiac history. In fact, Motor Trend named the entire 1965 Pontiac lineup as Car of the Year. They'd done that a few times, but it was a relatively rare occurrence. And I have to say, though, that the 65 Pontiacs were very deserving of that because, as you can see, they were not only beautiful vehicles, but they also had excellent engines, transmissions, suspensions, interiors. They really were the complete package. When you think about a car that was borderline perfection, the 65 Pontiacs are one that comes to mind for me because they just drive as good as they look. They're extremely rewarding to drive, with very smooth suspensions, despite the fact that Pontiac was really promoting performance. If you got a full-size Pontiac during this time frame, it was an absolutely boulevard smooth ride, frankly better than, I would say, any of the other GM divisions, Cadillac and Buick included. Now, the 65 Pontiacs also had beautiful exterior detailing and Coke bottle styling, and were done by a gentleman named Jack Humbert. He was in charge of Pontiac Design Studio during this time. But interestingly, Jack was, previous to leading Pontiac Studio, an interior designer. And, well, the 65 Pontiacs thankfully have an awesome interior as well, even though Jack didn't have necessarily anything to do with the 65s because he had moved to be the Pontiac Studio chief in charge of the exteriors. Now let's take a look at the 65 Pontiac interior, and another piece of beauty here. Everything is just finely detailed and amazingly gorgeous. Take a look at that gear shift lever. That was a Pontiac exclusive, similar to the turn signal stalk as well as the tilt column lever. Very thin and just, again, something they don't do today. All these levers and switchgear just look kind of chunky and generic, but Pontiac even thought to customize that during this time. This was also real wood on the instrument panel during this time frame that would stop after the 1966 model year in Pontiacs before being brought back again on the 73 Grand Am for a brief bit. But here, this is real walnut trim, and the steering wheel also has real walnut inlay on it. Now, the steering wheel on the 65 Pontiacs is a two-spoke design. It did carry over for 1966, and I just love the colored lucite portion of the wheel. You can see this car has a red interior, so it has a red wheel with this red lucite in it, and it's just an awesome-looking steering wheel. There were other cars that did have similar lucite wheels, but I thought that the overall interior package here and how the steering wheel complements the interior is just a beautiful element of the 1965 Pontiacs. And again, it's hard to say that you could get a better interior at really any price point with the real wood, this lucite wheel, beautiful gauges that are tilted toward the driver. I like the 65s a little bit better than the 66s because the 66s, those three gauges that are in the middle there were made square, and I don't know that I liked it as much as the 65s. But in any case, a sweet interior, a sweet exterior, and a sweet wheel for the 1965 Pontiacs. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the 1961 Oldsmobile. For 1961, all General Motors full-size cars were new, and Olds, as well as the others, debuted dramatic new styling and also slightly shorter overall lengths. The 61 Olds debuted an overall clean look with a very glassy upper. Notice the so-called bubble top windshield that you see here that extends up into the roof. giving the driver and passenger a feeling of openness and airiness in the cabin. Obviously, the side glass is also pretty prevalent on this car when you compare it with the roofline on the 59s that was relatively low. And that was one of the customer complaints about the 59 and 60s, was that the roof lines in the overall cars were low, as well as the seating height, and that was rectified with these 1961 vehicles. In addition to the tall windshield, some of the models also had very tall backlights, as you can see here, and thin roof design that made it look like the roof was just kind of suspended gently there over top of the car body. The Olds also had these jet-style exhaust taillights and skag lines that were pretty prominent on the lower portion of the body side, and this big spear, I guess you would call it, on the body side, something that Cadillac would later rob, let's say, on the 1971 designs, although in that case the spear was not sunken into the body but was proud of the body. And with that all-new body came an all-new interior, a handsome one with these oval shapes as the theme you can see in the gauges. You also had the rolling drum style speedometer that would change colors as you increased in speed. And you got a super cool steering wheel, this kind of safety style design, as some called it at the time, which meant that the center hub was recessed from the spokes, so that in the event of a crash, there wasn't some sort of a middle hub that was going to protrude into your chest. But that center hub on these is particularly beautiful. It's got like a spline design, and it says Oldsmobile in it. And I think it's one of the cooler steering wheels of the early 1960s, really in part because of that overall hub design. You can see it a little better here. The Oldsmobile is spelled out in block lettering in between those splines. And again, just an overall cool look. This car also has the parking brake with the light on it to show you that the parking brake is on. When it was on, that little light would illuminate and would inform you that you should take the parking brake off before driving away. Also love the stylized gear shift and turn signal indicator here. Again, an Oldsmobile exclusive back during a time when they used to design really everything on the interior and not use much in the way of common components across divisions. It's too bad that the 61 Oldsmobile looks so good. The only unfortunate part about it is that while there's a great engine underhood in the Rocket V8, you have to deal with the roto-hydromatic transmission, a relatively unreliable unit that right now is very hard to get serviced just because not many people understand the transmission any longer. Let's move on to number 4, and this is an oldie, the 1938 Oldsmobile. Now, in 1938, Oldsmobile didn't yet have the 88s, the 98s, etc. They did designate their models by the Oldsmobile 6, the Oldsmobile 8. Of course, the Oldsmobile 8 was not the Rocket 88 or the Rocket V8 during this time frame. This was a straight 8-cylinder engine that made 110 horsepower. And this is an Oldsmobile 8 Club Coupe that you see here. Pretty handsome car. I love the separate headlamps that are riding atop the fenders and the grille with the very prominent linear forms. Overall, a cool looking car and certainly a smooth operator with that flathead straight 8-cylinder engine under hood. Now, the 1938 Oldsmobile, while it looked cool on the outside, had one of the strangest looking steering wheels that I've ever seen on the inside. Take a look here. It's kind of a hybrid 2-spoke, 4-spoke design, if you will, where it actually is 4 spokes, obviously, but it's almost like you have these football shapes on either side of the steering wheel that are made by the steering wheel rim along with the spokes. And then you have this relatively small center section. And I suspect this was something that only lasted for 1 year. In 1939, Oldsmobile would go back to just kind of a standard 3-spoke wheel because it was relatively hard to turn, especially for cars without power steering. A lot of people were used to grabbing the spokes on the 3-spoke steering wheel, and here there's not a great place to grab. There's also not a great place to kind of just go straight down the road and rest your hand on the center hub because you have to rest it pretty inboard, and I think it was just an overall awkward steering wheel. But it certainly looks cool, and I suppose that that's what the designers were looking for when they put this one together. Let's move on to number 3. At number 3, we have another oldie, the 1940 Packards. Take a look here at this 1940 Packard 110 Coupe, an awesome-looking gangster-like car. If you were somebody of means in this time frame, a Packard could be a great choice to show up in style wherever you arrived. And the Packards at this era were certainly dominated by that prominent front-end grille that was very vertically oriented. And you have kind of the typical styling for the period with the rest of the front end in terms of the separate fenders and headlamps, although I love how the turn signals are riding atop the fender there. I thought that was a great detail from Packard. And also the relatively thin bumper with the bumper guards. Now on the inside, the 1940 Packards had great interiors, but one of the most beautiful steering wheels, I think, that was ever produced. Take a look here. Again, you can see this typical three-spoke design from the period, but Packard is the only one that I've seen that has these spokes where two of them are kind of swept up and have this beautiful radius to them as they integrate into the outer rim of the steering wheel. It almost looks like they're taking flight, or it's like a bird that's flapping its wings. And it's a beautiful sight to behold when you have the steering wheel straight and you're going down the road. Of course, you have the horn ring there as well that is encircling the hub, and then that is equidistant from the hub, and the horn ring is then equidistant from the steering wheel rim. It's just a great overall look on a really great looking car. And again, who could go wrong with a Packard from the era, no matter which one that you chose? Certainly on the inside, again, this steering wheel I think is just one of the most beautiful that has ever been designed. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have the 1961 Imperial. Well, you Mopar fans, here you are, one of the craziest steering wheels and craziest interiors ever put in any car, and crazy exterior. I don't think that anybody could say, by any stretch of the imagination, that a 1961 Imperial was conventional in any sense. You have these super strange pod-like headlamps up front that, by the way, required massive mounting brackets and hardware in order to make sure they didn't shake or jiggle when going over roadways. You have the super cool rectilinear grille with that little eagle in the driver's side of the grille, the Imperial Eagle. And of course, you have these enormous fins with these very little taillights hanging off of them, and an overall crazy, crazy exterior design, one that I love. The 61 Imperial, for me, doesn't matter if it's a two-door or four-door, I think is just an awesome piece of automotive machinery. These cars would also represent the end of the Virgil Exner era for styling at Chrysler, as he would be relieved of his duties in 1962 after the Plymouths and the mainline vehicles flopped in the marketplace. But the 61 Imperial, I think, is the most radical of any of the Chryslers that made it through to production in this model year. Let's take a look at the interior now. And here you have it, the craziest, funkiest steering wheel I think ever put in a Mopar, this Squircle-style Imperial wheel from 1961. It was used for a few years, but the first year was 1961. And obviously a few strange things about it. The first being its shape. I don't know how you went around the corner all that effectively with this Squircle-style steering wheel, but this is a shape of steering wheels that's become popular again, particularly with sporty cars. Of course, I don't think anybody was flinging their Imperial around corners, and the steering ratios were pretty slow during this time frame as compared to the sporty cars today that employ this shape for the steering wheels. But this is what Chrysler put in, and I love the center section as well, the two-spoke wheel with that center section that almost looks like it's fading into the horizon. It's just a beautiful look. Now, on top of the steering wheel, you have these crazy pods on either side of the speedometer that have the push-button torque flight transmission on the left, and you can see the turn signal indicator up at the top of that pod. And on the right are the climate control, as well as the heater door control. That's the little slider that you'd move up and down. So those are super strange, I would say, for the era. And if you take a step back, the Imperial also had kind of the strange seating arrangement with a higher back for the driver than the passengers, because, well, the driver should be more comfortable on a longer trip than the passengers. It's kind of an odd philosophy, but there were a lot of auto companies during this time frame that were trying to do something with the driver's seat versus the others. I'm not quite sure why, but that was in vogue at the time, and the Imperial tried it out. But the overall car was certainly radical, and the steering wheel went with the car. And now we've arrived at number 1, and that is the 1958 Edsel. Not sure that the Edsel would be number 1 on many lists, but here it is. Here's a 1958 Edsel, and you notice the unique shape about the front end, this kind of vertical theme, similar to Alfa Romeo, I guess. But that was designed up by the Ford stylist at the time because many different vehicles were emphasizing the horizontal nature of the grille, and they wanted something different for the Edsel that you would recognize from a mile away. And certainly people recognize the toilet bowl, horse collar, or whatever you want to call it, front end. Generally not in a flattering way, but I think that it's actually not a bad-looking car and has aged relatively well compared to other cars of the time frame. It just was not a sales success during the time period. I think that was in part due to the fact that customers were confused about where Edsel slotted in the Ford lineup. Was it above Mercury? Was it below Mercury? In fact, it was designed to slot between Ford and Mercury, and the lower series Edsels were based off of a Ford platform, while the upper series Edsels, like the Citation and the Corsair, were based off of the Mercury platforms. It had Mercury engines, the MEL V8s, the 410 cubic inch MEL V8, and the lower end Edsels had a shorter wheelbase and also had the FE V8 under hood. But while the exterior of the Edsel is certainly dramatic, take a look at the interior and the steering wheel. I think this is the coolest steering wheel ever because it has Edsel's TeleTouch typewriter style transmission where you push the buttons there on the center hub of the steering wheel. Now, in addition to that being just a cool feature, which, by the way, this was a electrically activated setup as opposed to the Chrysler setup where it was a cable when you were pushing the button for the push-button torque flight. This would actually have an electric servo that would move a lever in the transmission to engage a different gear. It unfortunately ended up proving to be problematic, and Edsel in 1959 would go back to the standard column shifter and eliminate this. But I think one of the cool things about it is that center hub on these Edsel steering wheels doesn't move. It actually is stationary. So you turn the wheel and those buttons stay in the place where they were originally when the wheel was just straight ahead. Of course, beyond the steering wheel itself, you have an awesome instrument panel on the Edsels. You have this center speedometer, which is very characteristic of Ford design during the time. Designer Dave Ash was in charge of a number of interiors for Ford, and one of his philosophies was always putting the speedometer right at the center of the driver's line of sight because it was the most important gauge. And you can see that in a number of vehicles, including this Edsel. You also have a very interesting, similar to the 1958 Lincoln, single HVAC control there off to the right that controls everything. Basically, in one place. There's not two different sliders or different controls. Again, something that was typical of some Fords during the era. But for me, this 1958 Edsel with the TeleTouch transmission, this is the pinnacle in terms of steering wheels of all time. So what do you think? Did I miss the boat? Did I get it right? Put a comment in the comment section. Which one is your favorite? Let me know. Thanks again for watching.